I never believed in ghosts until I saw the first one sitting in my cockpit just before takeoff. It was winter of 1944, freezing cold even inside the flight suit, and I was chewing on a stick of gum like it could keep my heart from pounding out of my chest. That morning, the fog was thick as soup, and the ground crews moved like shadows. I was staring straight ahead, trying to breathe slowly, when I saw him, Harry Mason. The guy had gone down in flames over Leipzig 2 weeks before. And yet, there he was, grinning at me from the co-pilot seat of my single-seat P-51 Mustang. Just for a second. I blinked, and he was gone. They say fear does funny things to the mind. But I swear, something shifted in the air that morning. A stillness, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Our mission was simple on paper: escort the bombers into the heart of the Reich, take down any Luftwaffe that showed up, and come home alive. That last part was always the trick. By then, the Germans weren't just desperate, they were inventive. Jet-powered Messerschmitts had started to appear. The Wunderwaffe, they called them. Wonder weapons. And they were faster than anything we'd seen. We were based in East Anglia, England, a sleepy stretch of airfields and muddy roads. They called our group the Bloody Nine, 9th Air Force Fighter Command. I flew with the 332nd Squadron, a mix of raw recruits and hardened ghosts with pilot wings. I was somewhere in between. 22 years old, with eyes that hadn't blinked right in months. Our target that day was a ball bearing plant near Schweinfurt. The place had already been hit hard in previous raids, but the Nazis kept rebuilding it. If you wanted to cripple a war machine, you took out the bearings. No bearings, no tanks. No tanks, no blitzkrieg. We took off just after 0700 hours. Engines roared like thunder, kicking up frost and gravel. The sky was bruised purple on the horizon, that strange color between night and morning. I remember thinking how quiet it felt despite the noise. My Mustang, Angel's Breath, purred beneath me, her fuselage gleaming silver in the pale light. She was a good bird. Fast, reliable. But even good machines couldn't keep you safe when the sky turned hostile. We formed up with the bombers somewhere over Belgium. B-17s, lumbering giants, flying in tight boxes like a school of steel whales. Their gunners waved to us, gave thumbs up. Some even smiled. That always broke my heart a little. Those boys depended on us. If we failed, they were meat for the grinder. At 23,000 feet, the air turned thin and bitter. I could see frost crusting the edges of my canopy. Far below, the patchwork of Europe scrolled by, rivers, forests, towns that looked like toys. But I wasn't looking down. I was scanning the heavens, watching for black specks against the blue. Enemy fighters always came from above or out of the sun, using speed and gravity to their advantage. And when they came like wolves, fast, sharp, and without mercy. Somewhere near the Rhine, a first warning crackled over the radio. A tight, clipped voice, bogies 10 o'clock high. That was Sergeant Talbot, our squadron leader. His voice always sounded calm, like reading a grocery list. But that call sent adrenaline flooding through my veins. I spotted them a moment later, a swarm of Messerschmitt Bf-109s diving out of the sun. At least 20 of them. Black crosses gleaming, cannons flashing. The bombers opened up first, their machine guns tracing lines of fire into the sky. Then it was our turn. The dogfight hit like a hammer. 1 second, we were gliding steady. The next, chaos. I pulled hard left, diving under a B-17's wing to flank an incoming fighter. Tracers zipped past my canopy like angry bees. I squeezed the trigger. My guns chattered, and I saw a burst of flame as the Messerschmitt spiraled away, black smoke trailing behind. It was my first kill that day. It wouldn't be the last. The radio became a storm of voices. I'm hit, going down. Cover the right flank. He's on my 6. I heard names shouted, names I knew. Men I bunked with, laughed with. Some of those voices cut off mid-sentence. I don't know how long the fight lasted. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 50. Time bends in the sky. But I remember one moment with crystal clarity. I was chasing a Focke-Wulf, fast, low, dodging like a snake. We came screaming over a frozen village, church steeple just below our wings. As I lined up my shot, I saw a second fighter drop in behind me. I knew I was dead, but then a flash, a roar. and the second fighter exploded midair. Pieces of metal and flames scattered across the clouds. I looked back, expecting to see Talbot, maybe Jenkins, covering me. But there was no one there. Just empty sky. No radio chatter. No silhouette. Just... the rest of the mission blurred into one long nightmare. We made it to Schweinfurt. Bombs dropped. The ground lit up with flat, black puffs that turned the sky into shrapnel. We lost 3 bombers on the approach, 2 more on the way out. I saw one peel open like a sardine can, bodies tumbling out, parachutes failing to bloom. We limped back to base well after dark. Half our squadron gone. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, even after I climbed out of the cockpit. Someone handed me a cigarette. I didn't smoke, but I took it anyway. Later that night, I went to the maintenance hangar to check on Angel's Breath. She was scorched, oil leaking from her belly, a long tear in the wing. But she was alive. Like me. As I stood there, I caught a glimpse of something in the hangar shadows. A shape? Just for a moment. A man in a flight jacket, helmet in hand, smiling. Harry Mason. And then just as quickly, gone. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But I started keeping track after that. Every time I saw a ghost, and I saw more than one, I came back alive. Barely, but alive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dead were flying with us. Watching, guiding, or maybe just waiting. Waiting for their turn to bring one of us home. The next morning, the frost was heavier, clinging to the hangar walls like cobwebs spun from ice, and the silence on base had changed, thicker, more reluctant, as if even the wind knew we had left men behind. No one spoke at breakfast. The usual banter, card games, and mess hall gripes were gone, replaced by the kind of silence that draped itself over your shoulders and stayed there. I sat alone with a tin cup of black coffee that had long gone cold, staring through the window toward the line of fighters on the tarmac, each one waiting like a nervous thoroughbred before the bell. Across the room, Sergeant Talbot was hunched over the flight roster with a pencil clenched in his fist, not writing, just gripping it like it might hold the names of the dead if he squeezed hard enough. We lost Jenkins, Moretti, and Field yesterday. All 3 of them were on my wing at one point during the mission. Jenkins had a laugh that echoed across the airfield, high-pitched and contagious, like a damn kid. Moretti was a neat freak who shined his boots even before night missions. Fields used to draw little cartoons of Hitler with donkey ears on the back of briefing sheets. They weren't just names on a chalkboard. They were real, loud, annoying, full of color. And now they were just smoke over Schweinfurt. The kind of smoke that turns to memory faster than you can say their names out loud. Later that day, the mechanics patched up Angel's Breath while I sat on an overturned crate nearby, feeling about 100 years older than I had been the day before. My hands still felt the vibration of her guns. My right wrist ached from the G-force turns, and every time I blinked, I saw that split-second flash, the German fighter exploding behind me, without warning or witness. I hadn't spoken to anyone about it. Not Talbot. Not the chaplain. Not even Andrews, my bunkmate, who usually sniffed out a story the moment it started brewing. It was mine, whatever it was, and I wasn't sure if it was a blessing, a warning, or just a mind cracked under pressure. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just nerves. Something else was in the sky with us now. Something not bound by wings or gravity. That night, after lights out, I lay awake listening to the soft creaks of the barracks settling and the distant hum of wind brushing against the sheet metal roof. Every now and then, someone turned in their sleep or muttered the name of a girl, a city, or a comrade now gone. I thought about home, Ohio, dirt roads, cornfields in the summer, my sister's yellow bike always left outside the garage no matter how many times my old man barked at her. I hadn't been home in nearly 2 years. My mother's letters had started to sound more like prayers than updates, like she was preparing herself for one of those telegrams. I couldn't blame her. I'd seen what came of boys whose mothers had stopped praying. Our next mission came sooner than expected. Intelligence said German production had relocated near Dresden, and the brass wanted us over the area before sunrise. They were worried the Luftwaffe was preparing a counterstrike, gathering their remaining fighters to defend the Eastern Front. Our job was to hit them before they hit us. Maximum impact, the colonel called it. Minimal mercy. His voice was always steel, polished, and sharp, but I noticed he didn't look us in the eyes that day. We launched in the blue hours before dawn, when the world still dreams and everything looks softer than it really is. My squadron, Only 7 of us now, taxied out under the moonlight, engines rumbling like ancient beasts waking from hibernation. As I locked into formation and lifted into the sky, I tried not to look at the empty space where Moretti's plane used to fly. It was still there in my mind, like a ghost limb. Crossing the channel, I felt the usual shift in the air. England behind us, Europe ahead. Over the radio, Talbot gave a quick check-in, all business, and we answered one by one. No one cracked a joke, no one even cleared their throat. I noticed something then. My altimeter was twitching slightly, a small tremor in the needle. I tapped the glass. It stopped, but the unease didn't. As we flew deeper into occupied territory, the cloud cover thickened, casting strange shadows over the wings of the bombers we escorted. The sun had started to rise now, bleeding through the sky in slow streaks of orange and red, painting the clouds like torn silk. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was how the color reminded me of fire, of fuel tanks ruptured midair, of parachutes never opening, of smoke trails spiraling toward the earth. About 30 minutes from the target, Andrew's voice cut in, low and confused. "Anyone else seeing that?" he said. A beat of silence. Then Talbot, "Seeing what?" Andrews didn't answer right away. "I don't know, our reflection. Starboard side, about 2 clicks out. Too fast for a cloud." I craned my neck, searching the sky. Nothing at first. Then, just for a breath, a flicker. A shape. It shimmered like light through water, then vanished. We didn't get time to dwell on it. A moment later, radar chatter lit up, warning of incoming fighters. Messerschmitts. At least 24, high and fast, diving straight toward the bombers. Talbot shouted orders, and we peeled off to intercept, slicing through the clouds like blades. Everything accelerated at once. The noise, the tension, the blood roaring in my ears. I rolled right, dropped altitude, and came up under a German twin engine, letting loose a burst that ripped through its belly. It shuddered, caught flame, and pitched down. Another kill. But for each one we got, 2 more seemed to take its place. The air was thick with metal and madness, planes spinning, engines screaming, bullets pinging off fuselages like hail. I saw one bomber hit directly in the nose, a perfect shot. It broke in 2. The front fell away like a disjointed jaw, and bodies spilled into the sky, tumbling like discarded puppets. I don't know what made me look to my left just then, but I did, and I froze. There, not 20 yards away, was a fighter I'd never seen before. Sleek silver, its markings all wrong, no swastikas, no stars, no symbols I recognized. And inside the cockpit, no one. Just empty glass, glowing faintly from within. It hovered, no, floated for half a second, then tilted its wings in what looked like a slow nod. And in that instant, a Messerschmitt bearing down on my 6 exploded. No shots fired. No warning. Just fire and air. I blinked. The strange plane was gone. I didn't tell anyone. Again. But Talbot gave me a look after we landed. One of those looks that says, I saw something too. And for the first time, I wondered, what if we weren't the only ones fighting up there? What if the war had woken something older? Something waiting, watching, or maybe protecting? The debriefing that followed was a strange blend of the usual formality and something quieter, more uncertain, like the officers themselves were holding back questions they didn't dare voice. We went through the numbers, how many sorties launched, how many returned, confirmed kills, missing aircraft. The mission had been a success, technically speaking. Dresden's supply lines were severed, 2 Luftwaffe squadrons were either destroyed or scattered, and our bomber group made it back with fewer losses than expected. But the room didn't feel victorious. Men sat stiffly in their chairs, their flight suits still damp with sweat, eyes fixed not on the chalkboard but on the empty spaces around them, as if afraid something unseen had followed them home. That night, the wind howled across the airfield like it was morning. I stood outside the barracks, the collar of my jacket pulled up, watching the clouds roll in from the north. There was a feeling in the air that reminded me of the nights before a thunderstorm back home, when the world paused, holding its breath, waiting for something to break. I lit a cigarette, something I only did after a mission, and listened to the distant hum of engines cooling in the hangars. I thought again about the silver fighter. Its impossible shape, its silent glide, and the way it had simply left, like a thought forgotten mid-sentence. I hadn't imagined it. I knew that now, and I wasn't alone. After a while, Talbot stepped up beside me, not saying anything for a moment, just staring into the darkness beyond the runway lights. He didn't look like the man who barked orders into a radio or drew attack plans in chalk. He looked tired, haunted. Eventually, he said, 3 days ago, over the Ardennes, I saw something I've never seen before. He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. We stood there in silence, watching the sky, and I understood that he had seen his own ghost, whatever form it had taken. The missions kept coming. No time to rest. The war machine rolled on, indifferent to what we felt or feared. By late January, we were flying nearly every other day. Berlin, Hamburg, Nuremberg. Cities that once seemed distant were now familiar patterns of fire and ruin beneath our wings. Each mission followed the same pattern. Take off in darkness, ascend into frostbitten altitudes, slip past the edge of fear, survive the fight, return with fewer friends. The Germans were running out of fuel and pilots, but the ones they had left were deadly. Boys barely older than me, flying on instinct and desperation, often alone, often on one-way flights. They called them wild sow wild boars, and they fought like it. But there was something else too. A new pattern. Reports, scattered at first, from other squadrons. Fighters appearing in impossible places, flashing in and out of visibility. Radio bursts that didn't follow known frequencies. Glimpses of aircraft with no insignia, no tail numbers, sometimes glowing faintly at the edges. They started calling them gremlins, half joking at first, the way soldiers joke to keep the fear manageable. But it wasn't funny for long. Some pilots swore the gremlins warned them, tipped a wing just before flak tore through the sky, blocked an enemy at the last second, then vanished before anyone else could confirm it. Others weren't so lucky. There were stories of planes diving out of formation and disappearing, of radios screaming static right before an ambush, of compasses spinning wildly moments before death. We all heard them, and none of us dismissed them completely. I began keeping a notebook, small, leather-bound, tucked inside my flight jacket. I wrote down every strange detail, every odd sighting or gut feeling that proved true. Some entries were just sketches, crude diagrams of lights in the clouds, or wing shapes that didn't match anything in our inventory. I didn't know why I was doing it, not at first. But the more I saw, the more I needed a record, something to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. That whatever was happening in the sky, it wasn't all in my head. And then came Munich. The briefing was short, brutal, and clear. The city was a key logistics hub, and Allied command wanted it crippled before the Red Army pushed in from the east. Our orders were to escort a wave of B-24s on a low-altitude run designed to catch the defenders off guard. The danger, of course, was that low-mint flak. Lots of it. The Germans had layered their cities and anti-aircraft like thorn bushes. Flying into that was suicide unless we did it fast and furious. That morning, the light was strange. The sun came up red and bloated, barely rising above the horizon before slipping behind a sheet of iron-gray clouds. It didn't feel like day. More like the color of cauterized wounds. As we climbed to altitude, the world below turned white with frost. The rivers frozen like veins beneath skin. The radio chatter was thin, less joking, more mechanical check-ins. We were all thinking the same thing. Munich was going to hurt. It did. We hit the outskirts just after noon, dropping into the flag zone like moths into a furnace. Explosions lit up the sky like strobe lights, the rhythm of death pounding in our ears. You could smell the metal, the burning oil, even through the oxygen mask. Bombers began falling almost immediately, one shredded from nose to tail, another engulfed in a sudden bloom of fire. We screamed through it, guns hot, engines overtaxed, ducking and weaving through clouds of smoke so thick they felt solid. And then, in the chaos, I saw it again. Off my right wing, no more than 30 yards away, was that same ghost plane. Silver. Seamless. No markings. It flew beside me, matching my speed, its presence utterly wrong and yet steadying. I couldn't see a pilot, couldn't hear anything, but I felt something, like a calm pressing into my chest, like a voice without sound saying, "This way." It tilted upward, sharply. I followed on instinct, pulling into a steep climb that should have stalled me. At that exact moment, a flak burst exploded where I had just been. I saw the black cloud bloom behind me, felt the shockwave rattle through the Mustang's frame. If I hadn't followed that impossible plane, I'd be dead. There was no doubt. And just like before, it vanished. When we returned to base, half the formation was missing. Talbot's bird limped in with one wing trailing smoke, his landing gear refusing to deploy. Andrews didn't return. Neither did Foster. We sat in the debriefing like survivors of a shipwreck, the adrenaline already fading into the kind of cold that doesn't come from weather. I didn't mention the silver plane. I didn't need to. The look on Talbot's face told me he had seen something too. His eyes flicked to mine for just a second, and I nodded. That was enough. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence in the center of a blank page. They are not all dead who fly above us. Then I closed it and sat in silence, listening to the wind, waiting for sleep to come, and wondering what else was waiting up there, just beyond the edge of what we understood. Was it something from our past, some ghost of a future war, or something older still? Whatever it was, I was beginning to think the skies over Germany weren't just a battleground. They were a threshold, and we had crossed it. Weeks passed, though the calendar hardly mattered anymore. Time had become elastic, days folded into one another, shaped only by the cadence of missions, the drone of engines, and the brief interludes of uneasy sleep. The war by then had become a vast, grinding apparatus, pulling us all deeper into its maw. Every mission felt like we were threading the eye of a needle, while the rest of the world unraveled around us. And yet, despite the chaos, I began to feel something else stirring in my chest, something I hadn't expected after all the death, after all the loss. A sense of connection, maybe, or clarity. A suspicion that what we were witnessing up there in the frozen sky wasn't just horror. It was something approaching revelation. The missions became stranger still. The bombers flew heavier and lower, their bellies full of steel, their wings buckling under the strain of carrying the war into Germany's final strongholds. But it wasn't just the combat that was changing. More pilots began reporting anomalies, flickers of light without sources, phantom aircraft that registered on radar then disappeared, instruments going haywire in cloudless skies. It wasn't isolated anymore. During a mission over Kassel, Lieutenant Bradford claimed he saw a spiral of lights descend from the clouds and dance between the wings of his bomber group, moving faster than any known aircraft. He described it like watching a school of fish made from lightning, then stopped talking entirely, as if even the memory of it unsettled him too much to continue. Another time, during a night patrol, one of our reconnaissance planes returned with camera footage that showed something no one could explain. An aircraft-shaped blur, elongated and pulsing, pacing the plane at impossible speeds, never seen by the crew during the flight. The brass tried to brush it off as a reflection, a lens malfunction, but they locked that footage away within the hour. The pilots weren't buying it anymore. The whispers spread. Some called them guardian spirits, others thought they were enemy weapons still untested. A few joked they were time travelers, lost in the wrong war. But behind every joke was a knot of real fear. I kept flying. We all did. What choice did we have? The war wasn't waiting for answers, and we were too deep into the fire to pause for questions. But every time I buckled into Angel's breath, every time my wheels lifted from the runway and the sky wrapped around me like cold silk, I found myself wondering whether we were being protected or studied, whether what I was seeing were echoes of men who had died in that same air, their spirits bound to the altitudes they had never returned from, or whether they were something else entirely, older, maybe, or simply other. Not malicious. Not exactly. But far beyond what we understood. Our next major mission was Regensburg, another industrial hub, another furnace into which we were expected to throw our lives. This time, though, something was different from the start. The weather was clear, unusually so for February. The sky above England was a perfect shell of blue, unmarred by even a strand of cirrus. It should have comforted me, but instead, it unsettled me. The calm before something. The silence that arrives not at peace, but at the eye of a storm. The briefing was straightforward. Escort bombers deep into southern Germany, protect them during their run, then pull back north through the Danube corridor. Straightforward in theory. In practice, it was a gauntlet. By then, the Luftwaffe had started deploying new tactics, fast strikes, coordinated flak traps, even ramming attacks from pilots who had no intention of surviving. One of their new squadrons was composed entirely of volunteers who were given just enough fuel for a one-way flight. The officers called them desperate. I thought they were committed, in the most terrifying sense of the word. We launched before dawn. Engines snarled to life, propellers slicing through the fog like blades through cloth. My squadron, reduced now to 5 planes including mine, rose in tight formation. The bombers followed, B-29s this time, experimental upgrades with longer range and heavier payloads. They were big, sleek, and quieter than the flying fortresses. I flew above them, scanning the horizon, trying not to think of who I might not see again at the end of the day. The first sign of trouble came just as we crossed the Rhine. My instrument started to pulse faintly, nothing extreme, just subtle shifts in the altimeter and a flickering light in the oil pressure gauge that had never flickered before. I tapped the glass as always. It steadied, but then the sky began to change. It was the color first, an unnatural tint that bled into the clouds like bruised gold, something just slightly off from any sunrise I'd seen. Then came the vibration, not through the plane, but in my own body. A hum beneath the sternum, as if a low-frequency sound were building deep within the earth and rising through the sky. I looked to my left and saw Talbot. He was glancing around too, brows drawn tight under his goggles. We locked eyes for a second. That was all we needed to know that we both felt it. Then they appeared. 6 lights, impossibly bright and small, descended from above, not falling but lowering, controlled, deliberate. They were positioned in a perfect hexagon, each one moving in a way that defied momentum. They didn't bank or roll. They just shifted like chess pieces on an invisible board. The bombers kept flying. Most of them didn't seem to notice. But every fighter in our squadron did. I heard someone breathe the word Jesus over the radio, followed by static. One of the lights peeled off and glided toward us, not threateningly, not aggressively, just as if inspecting. It moved to within 20 yards of my wing, and for a moment I saw it clearly. It wasn't a plane. It wasn't anything made by human hands. It had no seams, no propellers, no exhaust. Just a smooth, glowing presence, like polished stone lit from within. And in its glow, I felt something that shook me more than fear. Recognition. Not of the object itself, but of a presence. Like something had looked at me, really looked, and understood more about me in that moment than anyone on Earth ever had. Then, as suddenly as it arrived, it lifted away, shooting upward into the sky at a speed that left no trail, no echo. The others followed, each light zipping into the atmosphere until nothing remained but empty, sunlit sky. No one spoke. For the next hour, we flew in silence, each man alone with what he'd seen. Regensburg was a blur. Bombs dropped. Flak tore holes in the clouds. German fighters swarmed and were repelled. One of our B-29s was hit and exploded midair, debris raining down like broken stars. But we didn't lose anyone else in our squadron that day. Not one. And when we landed back in England, Talbot pulled me aside, his voice low and hoarse. He said, "Whatever they are, they were protecting us." I didn't answer. I couldn't, because deep down, I feared he was right. But I also feared that protection always comes with a price. One we might not understand until it's too late. In the weeks that followed the Regensburg mission, something shifted, not only in the war itself, which was beginning to tilt with increasing urgency toward an Allied endgame, but in us, the men who returned from that sky with questions none of us dared ask aloud. The war was still very real, still tearing through cities and lives with mechanical precision, but now tucked within the edges of every mission, there was a whisper of something else, some unseen intelligence watching from above the flak bursts and bullet trails. And although the daily routines remained unchanged, briefings, suit-ups, takeoffs, dogfights, debriefs, funerals, the mood among the pilots began to twist in ways the commanding officers couldn't quite name. We were still soldiers, still bound by orders and chain of command, but something had been introduced into our world that didn't obey those structures, didn't respect the lines we drew in our minds between the real and the impossible. It wasn't that the war suddenly lost its horror. If anything, it deepened. The closer we got to Germany's heart, the more ferocious the resistance became. The Luftwaffe, though fractured, fought with the desperation of a cornered animal. Flak gunners became more accurate, their bursts timed with uncanny precision. Towns that should have been abandoned opened fire as if fueled by sheer willpower alone. And in every village below us, columns of refugees dragged themselves away from the approaching firestorms, indistinct strings of humanity trailing into the forests. The bombing runs grew heavier, more calculated. Precision gave way to obliteration. Entire blocks disappeared in a single pass. The war was no longer about crippling infrastructure. It had become a psychological assault. We weren't just bombing cities. We were trying to unmake the enemy's will to fight. But even as the missions grew darker, the sightings increased. One evening, while flying a dusk patrol over the Ruhr Valley, I was caught in a sudden electrical disturbance. No storm clouds, no warning, just an abrupt flicker across the horizon and a violent surge through my instrument panel. My radio died instantly. My compass spun a full rotation and then locked in place, pointing west regardless of my heading. The air itself seemed to change density, becoming thick, almost syrupy, as though the Mustang were pushing through some invisible membrane. Then came the light. Not blinding, not burning, just radiant. Pale silver with a faint violet hue, humming like the low note of a cello string plucked slowly. It surrounded me for no more than 5 seconds, and then it was gone. Everything snapped back into place. The radio crackled back to life. The compass reset, and the air thinned. Later, the mechanics found no damage to the aircraft. No burns, no shorts, no mechanical explanation. When I tried to report it, I was met with narrowed eyes and quickly shuffled paperwork. I was advised to stick to verifiable details in my mission log. That night, Talbot passed me in the hallway without a word and slipped me a small folded note. Inside, written in a tight, deliberate script, were 4 words. "You're not the only one." I wasn't. The rumors were growing louder. A pilot from the 401st claimed he saw a formation of glowing spheres hovering above Berlin during a bombing raid. A gunner from a British Lancaster insisted he had fired directly at a disc-shaped object that didn't respond, didn't flee, just floated calmly amidst the chaos, as if observing. It wasn't just us anymore. The sightings were creeping across the Allied forces like a slow-moving shadow. Some whispered the term Foo Fighters, a name that came from somewhere in the Pacific Theater, now applied with nervous laughter to explain these events. Others didn't bother naming them at all. They simply nodded when asked, their silence more revealing than any report. Still, the missions had to continue. The brass wasn't interested in what we saw. They wanted targets hit, factories leveled, fuel depots crippled. So we kept flying, even as the boundaries of our understanding frayed. And every time I climbed back into Angel's breath, every time I pushed the throttle and felt the lift beneath me, I knew there was a chance I might not come back. But I also knew that if I did, I might return with another piece of the puzzle. That knowledge became my anchor. Not survival, not duty, understanding. Then came Dresden. Even now, decades later, I can barely think of that night without tasting ash on my tongue. The mission was framed in our orders as strategic: break the German railway network, cut supply lines, demoralize the population. But it was no secret that what we were doing went beyond that. It was a demonstration. A firestorm by design. More than 1,000 bombers took to the sky in staggered waves, with our squadron assigned to escort the final run, the one that would arrive after the city was already burning. Our job was to ensure nothing survived in the air to interrupt the last curtain of fire. We launched under a moonless sky, the darkness around us so complete it felt like flying through wet velvet. As we crossed into German airspace, the horizon ahead began to glow, not from the moon, not from stars, but from fire. Even at altitude, we could see the orange flicker of Dresden's outskirts already igniting. The earlier waves had done their job. We were arriving to finish it. But what we flew into wasn't just smoke and flame. It was something else, something more elemental. The firestorm had become a living thing. Wind currents whipped through the city with hurricane force, drawn upward by the inferno below. Whole buildings buckled and collapsed not from impact, but from the suction of the superheated air. The clouds above the city churned with their own weather, forming a vortex of smoke and lightning that spat electricity into the upper atmosphere. The bombers wavered, their formations buckling under the pressure. And in that moment, amid the madness, I saw them again. 5 luminous forms, high above the chaos, their shape less distinct this time, less like ships, more like thoughts made visible. They pulsed in synchrony, hovering in a perfect arc above the city's burning center. I don't know how to describe it properly, because what I felt in that moment wasn't fear. It wasn't even awe. It was a kind of reverence, like I was bearing witness to something sacred, even though it was surrounded by death. I don't know if they were watching us. I don't know if they were mourning what we had done, but I felt their gaze beyond pity, beyond judgment, pressing into the marrow of my bones. And for the first time in the war, I felt shame not as a soldier, but as a man. When we returned to base, we were silent. No one spoke during the debrief. No jokes, no comment, just checked boxes and cold coffee. Talbot stood at the edge of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the mission map as though it were a riddle he couldn't solve. I thought about Dresden burning, about the people who never had a chance to run. And I thought about those lights still hovering above it all, long after the bombs had fallen. That night, I dreamed of a sky without stars, where only those shapes remained, floating in the dark, waiting. And I woke up with the certainty, so strong it hurt, that they hadn't been there to save us or to condemn us. They had been there to witness.